Question: what futures belong to our present? This question, so aptly posed by Maya, suggests that there are multiple different futures and that they do not all belong to us. The importance of this plural, futures, does not merely hide in the fact that there are different outcomes of what's ahead, nor in the recognition of the obvious, that people expect, plan for, hope for, await, dredge, multiple and different tomorrows. We certainly do so, but such futures of ours would effectively be but faculties of the same thing, different exits in one labyrinth. My ethnographic research in the field of Gacko, in the southeastern Bosnian highlands, suggests that we need to seize the multiplicity and difference of futures and time more generally, take them seriously, and through them rethink the political constitution of our fields of research. To phrase it this way, taking difference seriously, taking others seriously, you already maybe recognize it as the shibboleth of the so-called ontological turn crowd, and perhaps rightly so, as they participated in the articulation of something brewing in anthropology for a longer time, namely that whilst we can see alternative truths as different aspects of one thing, if something is significantly different, we will struggle to get rid of ourselves before being able to actually approach it. Yet, as they say in many of our South Slavic languages, nisi repa bez korijena. You are not a turnip without root. And so the ontological turnip, excuse me for the bad pun, is also not without its roots, and it begins earlier, particularly since the 70s, and the conversations on the universality of anthropological concepts, the recognition of systems of power and knowledge, and the place of anthropologists, researchers therein. The ontological group does acknowledge their predecessors. One of them, the late Roy Wagner, posed an important question in his 1986 Symbols That Stand for Themselves, a question that I have repeated before and I would like to repeat here again. Are there different kinds of time or merely different ways of counting time? Does time have a structure as a clock does, or does it merely seem to have a structure because a clock has one? If we recognize that there are kinds of time, we may further ask, are we talking about qualitatively different phenomena, habitually grouped within what we call time? I prefer to think of the English word time as a theoretical heuristic at most, and I have encountered many other words for time during my research in southeastern Bosnia. So what we call time may be incommensurable from one context to the next. Yet, my developing appreciation of temporal difference was concomitant with an understanding of temporal coexistences. How do different temporalities come to be co-orchestrated, attuned towards the same future? For example, how does it happen that the settled people in southeastern Bosnia cannot articulate time, particularly springtime, without a reference to the nomadic Gurbeti Roma? Or, similarly, that the summer cannot be uttered without the entwined lives of Muslims and Orthodox Christians. These relations grew into the tissue of time. They became inseparable from the future horizons. Such thickened futures insist upon themselves. They haunt these landscapes even after ethnic cleansing and the deep political divides that followed. To think of time, we then have to think of temporal syncretism, the merging of different temporal frameworks, as well as temporal anti-syncretism, the antagonism to temporal synthesis. And here I obviously borrow from Shaw and Stewart in their work on religious syncretism, which I wrote about in terms of religion, but here I want to think of temporal syncretism. The modern time, so-called abstract time, was part of an enduring distemporalizing project to define the world as such, to attune it to the same ultimate measure. It was anti-syncretic. It denied different conceptualizations, like the cyclical sacral calendar of Southeast Bosnia. However, this anti-syncretism was not tenable for those who wanted to keep the cyclical calendar but had to align to the time of the state institutions. Such people in Gatsko had to negotiate different temporal frameworks, sometimes merge them, sometimes suspend one kind of time and temporality and switch to another. In the field of Gatsko, different futures, willy-nilly, lived within the same landscape and even within the same individual body. They fought, entwined, and communicated with each other, often on a daily basis. So what were these futures? Let me briefly sketch out three prominent temporal orientations of grand social projects that pertained to the field of Gatsko, which sought to guide the collective and subjective positionings of my interlocutors. And all of these projects and all of these futures and experiences were intertwined. The first future. The entire year in the field of Gatsko used to be oriented towards Ilindan or Alijun, the same day, the day of Elijah. Everyone knew the saying, dopodne Ilija, odpodne Alija, until noon Ilija, afternoon Alija. The proverb referred to the 2nd of August, the celebration of Saint Elijah feast, a central date for the orientation of the annual cycle in Muslim and Orthodox Christian calendars. It was the time for a grand harvest feast, which included rituals, singing, dancing, food and drink, market stalls, athletic competitions, and so on. This feast was shared by Muslims and Orthodox Christians who lived in the field of Gatsko, which I otherwise refer to as simply the field, from polje and the ways in which my interlocutors referred to it. In the proverb, until noon Ilija, afternoon Alija, Ilija is the Orthodox Christian or Serb name for Elijah, and Alija the Muslim name for Elijah. Ilija is also one of the most common Orthodox Christian names, and Alija one of the most common Muslim names in Bosnia more generally. So they become sort of a code for the common person in that sense. Christians would hold the service next to the church in the morning and Muslims next to the mosque in the afternoon. And very often they describe these divisions as a possibility for the two groups to intermingle and to attend both of these festivities. The large feast of Elijah's Day was an expected future that oriented the whole landscape and the period of strenuous labor in the warm season. It was also described as the final outlet before the winter. Apart from singing and dancing, there were arranged marriages, circumcision rites, and even group fistfights or mass fistfights, which were ritual. They happened almost every year, except one year in communist Yugoslavian police forbade it because there was some wounding that went a bit too far. But all of this was described as a release of energy, all kind of energy, before this very long winter that would lock the whole landscape in snow until April. And so as soon as one Elijah's Day ended, they would all start looking forward to the next one and planning the next one. And I literally have this quote from one of my interlocutors, but everybody else described it. As soon as one day is over, we start planning, we look towards the next one. So it was this sort of expected future that structured the entire year. One cannot understand Elijah's Day without George's Day, however, Đurđevdan or Jurjevo. On the 6th of May, the warm season inaugurated by St. George was also a season of work in the field and with cattle. As the horizon began to melt from the snow, people would embrace the expected future. the nomadic Gurbeti Roma would arrive and set up their camps around the Blagovijesti, the Annunciation, which is slightly before, around the 7th of April. The Roma George's Day feast included a large bonfire around which they would dance together with the Christians and the Muslims. As Eno told me, one of my interlocutors, the Roma were orientational for them, for the settled people. After a long winter, believe me, people longed for them just like they longed for spring. Just like when you wait for your exam dates or the way a feast is expected, so people waited for the gypsies. Together with the changing landscape, they were also disorientational for the settled people, and it was part of this sort of change in the landscape more generally. And I really don't want to romanticize any of these images, and I know that because this return to the past is idealized, it reads as romantic it is. There is kind of a romance in these the narratives about these relationships. So George's Day was a fertility feast, first and foremost. Mothers would take their children towards the shed and place their head on a tree stump and swing with an axe. They would cut the children's hair so that it would grow better. Swings would be tied to old oaks, and boys would push girls into the air. The girls sang a peculiar song about the dragon stealing a young woman to marry her. Dragon flying from the sea to Danube. Young women would also plant nettle leaves in the cattle manure or in front of their houses, interpreting the direction of their marriage proposals by how the leaves would turn. Women also visited water rapids in the morning and bathed nude. Young men would hide behind bushes to sneak a peek. The women would pick miloduch, hyssop flowers, and adorn their front doors. The men would try to steal their virginal flowers, and the women in turn would performatively try to prevent them from doing so. George's Day is tied into the wider Indo-European cosmology in which women negotiate between the world and the underworld, chthonic beings, life and death, through their fertility. It was at the beginning of the vegetative cycle that would ceremoniously draw to a close on Elijah's Day. The second future. In the 70s, or what began already in the 60s but was realized in the 70s, the socialist state built a gigantic thermal power plant on one site of Elijah's Day feast in Jasike. It was supposed to be not only a different future, but an altogether different measure of time. Eno, one of my interlocutors who I introduced earlier, he said, "I remember it. I was quite young when I went there with my late grandmother. Alijun was celebrated at a place called Jasike, which means the aspens, with huge aspen trees giving comfortable shade. This is a place that unfortunately no longer exists today. It has been buried. It is where the waste from the thermal plant is dumped. It was seized during the construction of the plant. The expropriation of the land was done legally. There's nothing special about that story. But this is where the first Alijun festivities took place. Horse races, marathons, various athletic disciplines, long jump, shot put. Many loves started there. Marriages were forged. When this place was buried, one kind of future was supposed to be supplanted by another. The sudden modernization might be gauged from the alluringly concise propaganda documentary called Izgradnja rudnika i termoelektrane Gacko, Construction of Mine and Thermal Power Plant Gacko, made by a name you might recognize, Hajrudin Krvavec, a Yugoslav director celebrated for the partisan genre. Now, the film, I wanted to show bits of it, but I don't have time. Please do have a look on YouTube. It's a very interesting film for talking about these kind of distemporalizations, and I'll tell you about bits of it. It begins with images of shepherds running after herds of sheep and horses through the field in front of the power plant, and a narrative on the brutality of the bare life of the peasant. The narrator states, "Here, the human being is destined to be born, to leave and never return, or stay and battle the cold and the wolves, wretched faith and such a God, always getting worse and worse, always after the flock, one's only hope." Through the next hour, the film describes the glorious transformation of landscape in meticulous detail. These necessitous humans of the field, it says, grew crops and buried their dead, but could not even suspect the immeasurable layers of coal, lignite in particular, lying beneath, which were about to change their destiny. To this day, however, people in Gatsko remember that the plant was constructed on top of the old locus of Elijah's Day celebration, thus violently displacing their most important annual ritual. Knowingly or not, the film underscores this spatio-temporal intervention. And this is an actual quote from the film. The narrator says, "Time here will once be measured like this. There will be the time before the mine and the thermal power plant, and there will be the time after them." The decrease in agricultural activity, according to the documentary, was the socialist dream. The plant was supposed to emancipate. Its actual effects on rural economy were staggering. Between 71 and 91, we see a sharp decline in the number of sheep, horses, and cows owned, and the percentage of actively agricultural in overall active population. It slides from 83.6% in 71 to 17 in 1991. Was the socialist modernist utopia able to distemporalize the cyclical future? Not fully. People moved their feast to another location in the village of Kula. Interestingly, hegemonic as it was, the socialist calendar did not simply pour into the traditional one. Rather, it roughly followed it. The Yugoslav calendar Dunja Richtman-Augustin has noted followed the basics of the traditional and religious cycle of winter and spring holidays, but imposed its own rhythm by anticipating or postponing the important moments. Traditional Tuesday gatherings were sometimes moved to Saturdays or Sundays to accommodate the state calendar. Similarly, after the 1990s war, the returnees to Gatsko moved the dates of Elijah's feast to accommodate the diasporic attendance, often agreed over social media. This readiness to be flexible in light of new political and social circumstances should be seen as an important element of temporal resistance. We thus see an attempt to substitute the traditional spatio-temporal framework with the new socialist one. The power plant, as the image of new temporality, literally buried the ritual place as the image of old temporality. The third future. Another significant intervention came with the revival of nationalism, which culminated in the 1990s war. The field of Gatsko was cleansed of its Muslims, Gurbeti Roma, and those who publicly disagreed with such violence. Houses and temples were destroyed, and the fleeing population went into exile into Western Europe, United States, various parts of Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, possibly Slovenia. I don't know if you meet any Gatsko communities in Ljubljana, let me know. When I first conducted fieldwork there, only a handful of elderly Muslims returned to their villages. The Gurbeti Roma never returned. The town was completely ethnically homogenized. The returnees lived in fear, completely disenfranchised and without access to public jobs. They were occasionally attacked and intimidated. On one of the mosques that they rebuilt was burnt down for a second time. The town was covered with statues and graffiti celebrating war criminals. Graffiti read, "Ratko is our hero," referring to Ratko Mladic, found guilty of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. Another one read, "Šešelj is coming." Šešelj dolazi. Vojislav Šešelj, a convicted war criminal, who was then imprisoned. In 2013, as part of a municipal project to beautify Gacko, a wall next to the church was adorned with graffiti saying Kosovo and Metohija, the soul of the Serb man. Now, I don't know whether, Nicholas, you will be talking about the centralization of Kosovo by the Serbian Orthodox Church and this kind of sense of the Serb Jerusalem and this kind of eternity and tied to eternal future of the Serb nation and so on. But I actually want to focus on the other graffiti which says Šešelj is coming. Now this suggestion that a person who is now a convicted war criminal is coming, is a future imminent, a warning. The graffiti indicating the heroic return of war criminals was part of the wider nationalist temporal framework, which functioned through the memorials of suffering, references to martyrs of war, and constant warnings about the dangers of living together with the other. These warnings about the future would most often occur in sacro-political speeches, during religious events, in front of the new monumental church in the town center. The church and the speeches symbolize a new spatio-temporal orientation. It stood next to the destroyed town mosque, which the returnees were trying to reconstruct. We see a project of distemporalization, an organized attempt to reconfigure the social through its temporal orientations. And we see that the place symbolizing the new temporal order is constructed at the site of what signified the older temporal relations. So just like with the power plant. The two chronotopes, this kind of merging of time with the landscape of Gacko, this kind of claim over the landscape in conjunction with a particular kind of time. So we see the kind of the nationalist one and the one kind of arguing for this traditional time. These two chronotopes led paradoxical lives. They were fashioned against each other, yet they strove to forget each other. Forgetfulness had been possible, but only temporarily. There was always a slip, a fracture, a moment that led into face-to-face encounter with the other chronotope. In the field, the discrete and intimate desire for the home of the past contained signs of collective attunement towards the future. It was negotiated through and always contrasted to the present. The waiting for Elijah became double-coded. The second kind of waiting of the field, a fragile hope, a longing, or even a dedicated investment, was a post-war temporality, a waiting for the return of cosmological time, along with the communal landscape it used to entail. The diasporic visitors would return for a single day on the 2nd of August, and the field was again full of people, music, laughter, food, and dance. It was a waiting for the field to resemble itself. Reinstating the celebration, the single most important date in the field, the few returned refugees reconstructed a piece of their home. But each time the diasporic visitors said their farewells, the year was again colored by waiting. And I discussed this sort of double-coded waiting in my book, which gives the title to the book, Waiting for Elijah, as a form of waiting to wait, or waiting for the traditional kind of waiting, a return to the cyclical future. The field's idealized turn to the cyclical rhythms of bodies and landscapes has produced a collective positioning. Given the absence of a younger generation, however, the transfer of memory has shifted from public performance to a kind of intimate chronicle. The narrative was energetically searching for its place. Unstationed, this bodily immersion in the past landscape lingered like a phantom limb. Its sensations were relived with the excitement and texture of immediacy, before regressing into the acknowledgement of loss. I was offered in their daydreaming a landscape that had long appeared to me the sole topic of this research, It was only when I started transcribing my recorded conversations that I noticed the endings, the regressions. To give you an example of such moments where this past that is experienced as immediate sort of regresses into the present or breaks into the present. I have a couple of these quotes that ended some of these conversations. So number one, there, that's how it was. There was beauty. There really was. There were many things, but there you go. Number two, there is no life, not here. It won't. There is no life. Number three, by God, there was lots of stuff before, my son, and today it cannot be. They've taken all of this. Today, nothing can be as it was before. And number four, they are no more. There are no more fairies, no good ones. Good people are, in this cosmology, a particular kind of person, Dobri, with a capital D, considered these saintly figures. There are no good ones. There are no fairies. There's nobody to see ustvarja, the ghostly apparitions, nor to experience nur, the supernatural light from the graves of the good. These and hundreds of similar temporal adjustments were how long narratives of how it used to be often ended. The present committed repetitive acts of violence upon the effectively returning landscape. All the epilogues were moments of disenchantment. The general tenor of narration would take a sharp turn from rich and vibrant descriptions, visceral and tactile reconstructions, and often laughter, towards brief, fractured and sober realizations of an explicit loss and the usual moment of silence. Elaine Scarry argued that physical pain might resist language, but also simultaneously shatter it by deconstructing it into the pre-language of cries and groans. The awakening silence following narratives in Gatsko is a shattered language or a post-language, a bodily arrest at the overwhelmingly unnarratable, an inexpressibility marking the point where the two chronotopes face each other. Silence, or rather the gasp of silence in the field, is a response to the present, an inability and a bodily refusal to protract the unwanted horizons. Now, I have probably a couple of minutes, so I'm going to skip or perhaps talk through my last paper here. What I wanted to mention is that there are various kinds of entrepreneurs, as Maya termed it in the abstract for this symposium. And I understood this, and Maya also explained it in such a way, in very broad terms, so that I can think of these 90-year-old interlocutors of mine as particular kinds of entrepreneurs. And if we shift perspective to them as a kind of entrepreneur, even though perhaps they're not leaving their household most of the time, but have particular strategies of dealing with the future, or implementing the future, or attempting to implement a particular kind of future. In this case, one related to Saint Elijah, the cyclical calendar, the return of the community related to that cyclical calendar. And what they would do is, first of all, insist on certain stories. And when I say stories, it's probably the wrong term to use, because these stories were narrated in such a didactic way, and they would latch on, or attempt to latch on, to anybody who would listen, and who was younger. And when I started doing this research, this young anthropologist who arrived in place of all those young people who were missing, who would otherwise be inducted into these cosmologies, into these futures, I was the one to receive it. There was another friend of mine, Edo, who was younger there, and his grandmother constantly introduced him to the herbs. What will poison you? What will heal you? What will, this is, if there is a war, these are the caves where we hide. This is where we hid you when you were 3 months old, in these caves. So all of this kind of knowledge about the landscape, about this kind of temporal framework was very much transferred didactically. And then there were different kinds of positionalities in terms of kind of the expectations within this waiting. There was very adamant insistence that there will be life again here, especially a small reconstruction crew, as I call them. They literally every morning woke up at 5 a.m., went to reconstruct the town mosque and other places, houses, and took care of these elderly returnees and so on. And then there were those who were much more silent on such hopes. So to repeat that question, what futures belong to our present, or what futures belong to the Gatsko present, it might seem that no futures belong to the present, or rather that the present doesn't belong to any of these futures that people want. And the present is kind of violent in these experiences of time. And past and the future are sort of kind of allied together. And this appears in other ethnographies. If you've read Steph Janssen's work, the recent book on yearnings in the meantime, there's also that sort of alliance between the past and the future against sort of present temporality. But I do think that if we turn to kind of these cyclical notions of time and to think of futures not simply as different kinds of outcomes, but qualitatively different kinds of phenomena, that we might that it might be productive for us as anthropologists. So I skipped a little bit, but thank you so much for listening to this one.